At 2:40 a.m. on December 24, 2025, the Russian port of Novorossiysk continued its nightly rhythm as though nothing unusual was happening. Cargo cranes moved slowly, lights shimmered on the calm water, and routine communications echoed between the harbor towers. There was no alert, no sound of sirens, no evasive maneuvers. To anyone watching from the shore, it was an ordinary winter night on the Black Sea. But beneath the surface, the silence hid something else entirely. Deep underwater, invisible to radar and untouched by sonar, a small group of unmanned underwater vehicles, known as sea babies, had already begun their final approach. They were slow, silent, and precise, designed to move in darkness without giving away their presence. Their mission was not to disrupt the port, not to scatter attention, but to strike a single, specific target with surgical precision. Inside the bay rested one of Russia's most valuable naval assets, a Project 636 Varshavyanka submarine, a diesel-electric vessel armed with caliber cruise missiles. It was a weapon of immense strategic value, quiet, capable, and feared. That night, however, it was also vulnerable, docked, unguarded in any extraordinary sense, and unaware of what was coming. The Ukrainian operation had been planned for weeks, built on intelligence, timing, and the art of exploiting overconfidence. Every movement of those sea babies had been programmed to avoid detection by acoustic sensors, to pass beneath known patrol routes, to stay out of the radar cones sweeping above. By the time Russian systems could have noticed, it was already too late. The sea babies separated near the entrance to the port. One acted as a decoy, transmitting faint signals meant to draw attention. The others continued their glide toward the submarine, hugging the seafloor in the narrow channel. In those critical minutes, Novorossiysk remained quiet, unalarmed. The first drone attached itself beneath the submarine's hull, not detonating immediately, but waiting. A second followed seconds later, positioning along the lower structure of the vessel. Their programming was simple yet devastating. Strike from below, where armor was thinnest, where water pressure could do the rest. At 2:49 a.m., the sea erupted in a muffled, deep concussion. Not a fireball, not a surface explosion, something worse. A contained underwater blast that tore through the internal compartments of the Varshavyanka, deforming its structure and disabling vital systems in seconds. Within moments, the port's lights flickered. Security monitors went blank as pressure waves reached the shore. Some cameras caught the faint plume of water rising, followed by a second explosion. It was no accident, no technical fault. It was a calculated strike. The submarine was instantly rendered inoperative. Water flooded its interior, electrical systems failed, and the missile launchers, once ready for combat, fell silent. The crew initiated emergency evacuation while chaos erupted across the dock. Only then did Russia's defense systems awaken. But by that point, the attack was over. Ukraine had completed what no other navy had attempted so boldly, disabling a Russian submarine inside its own secure port without a single direct confrontation. Those 8 minutes changed everything. A vessel worth hundreds of millions was neutralized by machines that cost a fraction of that sum. There were no intercepted signals, no radar alerts, no intercepted missiles, just silence and precision. For the first time, the Black Sea had witnessed a new kind of warfare. It wasn't about domination through size or numbers. It was about control through innovation. The sea babies had proven that invisibility no longer belonged only to submarines. It now belonged to the ones who could think smaller, move quieter, and strike where it hurt the most. In the minutes following the blast, confusion spread through every command channel. Water pressure readings in the port became erratic. Acoustic sensors sent conflicting data. Security officers weren't sure whether they were witnessing an internal malfunction, an accident, or an act of war. But deep inside the submarine, the truth was undeniable. Compartments were flooding uncontrollably, the pressure hull was warped, and every electrical circuit was failing. The submarine was blind, powerless, and trapped. The drones had not been built to destroy entirely, they had been built to disable, and they succeeded. As the crew evacuated, one remaining drone transmitted the final images from beneath the waves, confirmation that the mission was complete. Then, it self-destructed, leaving behind only fragments. What followed was pure disarray. Russian patrol boats circled the dock, floodlights sweeping across the dark water. Emergency crews worked frantically to seal the flooding sections of the submarine, but it was impossible. The damage wasn't visible, it was internal, structural, beyond any quick repair. Within minutes, a secondary internal blast confirmed the worst fears. The Warszawianka was not just damaged, it was finished as a combat vessel. The pride of the port had become its burden. And all of it happened before any Russian officer had time to comprehend what was unfolding. No radar saw the approach, no sonar recognized the sound, no defense system fired a single shot before it was over. The attack was as much psychological as it was tactical. It revealed the fragility of what Russia considered secure. The port that had symbolized safety was now a reminder that in modern warfare, no harbor is untouchable. Follow to stay updated as we uncover how this single operation reshaped the balance of power in the Black Sea and beyond. By the time the port alarms finally activated, it was already 3:04 a.m. The Black Sea Fleet's local command center came alive in panic. Orders overlapped, radios crackled, and radar screens filled with meaningless echoes. In those moments, no one could clearly understand whether the port was still under attack or if the threat had passed. The automated defense systems kicked in on instinct. Anti-aircraft guns like the AK-630s began firing bursts into the night, tracing lines of orange light across the dark water. The Panzer M defense systems joined in, spraying the surface with shells. The water lit up with explosions, waves reflecting the chaos back toward the shore. But there was nothing to hit. The real attackers were gone, leaving only silence and the growing sense that something irreversible had happened. At 3:09, one of the Russian destroyers fired short-range rockets at what appeared to be surface contacts outside the port perimeter. The explosions raised huge pillars of foam and debris, but the targets were decoys, programmed to lure gunfire, to make Russia reveal its defensive patterns. Ukraine's sea babies had forced a fleet 10 times larger to fight shadows. One by one, Russian vessels joined the assault on the empty sea, firing missiles, deploying depth charges, and activating sonar networks that could no longer distinguish between marine life and mechanical ghosts. Each detonation was money spent, ammunition wasted, data exposed. Within minutes, Novorossiysk was a battlefield without an enemy. Helicopters Ka-27 took off from nearby decks, dropping sonar buoys across the coastal zone. Frigates maneuvered in crossing patterns, creating fire corridors to prevent any potential follow-up strike. But the mathematics of the situation were devastating. Every missile launched at a drone that cost a few $1,000s meant a loss of hundreds of thousands from the Russian side. Each second of reaction drained the port's readiness further. Ukraine did not need all the drones to survive. It only needed Russia to keep firing. And Russia did exactly that. For 15 minutes, the Black Sea Fleet waged war against the dark. By 3:21, one drone signal was confirmed less than a kilometer from a patrol vessel. The ship opened direct fire, hitting its target and confirming that at least one enemy object still existed underwater. The explosion triggered an even larger panic. Fleet commanders ordered an expansion of the defensive perimeter. More rockets were fired into the open sea, hitting nothing but floating wreckage and sea foam. The Black Sea became a roaring, burning field of confusion. Flares illuminated the coastline, casting long shadows over cranes and warehouses, while loudspeakers blared conflicting orders. Yet even amid the gunfire, the truth was becoming evident. The real damage had already been done. The submarine was gone. The mission was complete. What remained was fear. At 3:34, the Russian command issued an order to cease fire. Not because the situation was clear, but because the cost of continuing blind defense had become unbearable. Friendly ships risked hitting one another. Ammunition stocks were depleting. Sensors overheated from constant use. The port was alive with activity, but operationally it was paralyzed. The attack had lasted less than 20 minutes in total, yet its impact would be measured in years. The silence that followed the gunfire felt heavier than the explosions themselves. The port of Novorossiysk was still illuminated, but its rhythm was broken. It no longer felt like a stronghold, it felt like a target. By 3:47, the entire harbor was under emergency lockdown. Ships remained anchored with engines running, but orders forbade any movement. Anti-submarine teams began scanning the waters, releasing small nets and deploying portable sonar systems. Every minor echo was treated as a threat. Even drifting debris was investigated. Inside the damaged dock, engineers were attempting to assess the true extent of the submarine's damage. What they found was beyond repair. The hull was bent inward, 2 compartments were flooded beyond recovery. The electrical grid had collapsed, leaving no power to stabilize the remaining systems. The Warszawianka could not be saved. It was not sunk, but it was no longer a weapon. It had become an inert structure, an expensive, symbolic monument to vulnerability. At 4:10, the Black Sea Fleet's Central Command in Sevastopol issued a directive to halt all scheduled naval exercises and recall vessels into dispersed defensive patterns. The entire strategy of the region shifted overnight, from projecting power to preserving what was left. The fleet's doctrine of deterrence was suddenly obsolete. The idea that ports offered protection to major assets had been disproved in a single night. The drones, simple in construction yet devastating in purpose, had rewritten the logic of maritime warfare. Every future decision would now carry the shadow of Novorossiysk. Over the next hour, Russian vessels moved cautiously through the darkness, avoiding each other's sonar zones. Civilian maritime traffic was suspended indefinitely. Communication between fleets became limited to encrypted bursts. Inside the command center, the atmosphere was tense and quiet. Officers spoke in low voices, unable to process the fact that a handful of underwater drones had forced one of the world's largest navies into defensive retreat. By 4:32, an internal order was confirmed. Every ship carrying caliber cruise missiles must increase distance from the coast and minimize time spent docked in stationary positions. The order was clear and final. Staying still had become a tactical danger. The Black Sea Fleet, for the first time, could no longer rest in its own ports. The economic and psychological consequences began to unfold immediately. The loss of a submarine valued between $400 and $500 million was severe, but the deeper damage lay in exposure. Every radar frequency used that night had been recorded, every defensive response observed. Ukraine's operation had not only destroyed an asset, it had gathered data. The mission demonstrated that with the right precision and timing, even the most fortified naval base could be breached quietly. For Russia, this realization was devastating. It shattered the perception of security that had defined its presence in the region for decades. By dawn, the port looked deceptively calm. The lights still glowed over the water, cranes stood motionless, and small patrol boats moved in cautious patterns. Yet the heart of the fleet was wounded. Engineers, divers, and military analysts worked side by side to understand the full scope of what had occurred. Some whispered about sabotage, others about electronic warfare, but the simplest explanation was the most troubling. A small fleet of autonomous underwater vehicles had outperformed an entire defensive network designed to protect one of the largest military installations in southern Russia. The impact extended beyond the Black Sea. Across NATO command centers, analysts were studying the event in real time. European media outlets began reporting unconfirmed explosions near Novorossiysk before dawn. Social networks filled with satellite images and fragments of intercepted transmissions. Kiev remained silent, offering no official statement, but the pattern was familiar. In previous months, Ukraine had already demonstrated new capabilities using unmanned surface drones in the Sevastopol raids. But this time was different. This was not a strike on the surface. It was a blow from below, deeper, quieter, and far more sophisticated. It marked a turning point not just for Ukraine's campaign, but for naval warfare itself. The morning of December 24th began with a new reality. Russia's most secure port had been breached. Its Black Sea command had been humiliated in the heart of its own territory. The balance of power, once measured in tonnage and missile range, was now measured in algorithms, sonar signatures, and silence. Every admiral from Sevastopol to Moscow understood that the game had changed. The Black Sea, once dominated by heavy steel and nuclear capability, now belonged to the shadows beneath it. Stay tuned, because what followed next would not only confirm Ukraine's growing technological advantage, it would reveal how the consequences of this single night began to ripple far beyond the Black Sea, reshaping alliances, strategies, and the future of underwater warfare itself. When the first light of dawn touched the horizon over Novorossiysk, the Black Sea looked deceptively peaceful. The surface shimmered under the early winter sun, seagulls circled the cranes, and the faint hum of generators echoed across the docks. Yet beneath this fragile calm, the weight of the night lingered. The attack had not just damaged the submarine, it had pierced through the very doctrine of Russian naval confidence. What unfolded over the next 24 hours would expose the depth of that wound, not only militarily, but politically, economically, and psychologically. By mid-morning, Russian military engineers, divers, and intelligence officers swarmed the damaged dock. They examined the submarine's hull, cameras capturing twisted metal plates and ruptured compartments. The once pristine black surface of the Warszawianka was warped beyond recognition. The crew, evacuated and shaken, provided their initial reports. No warning, no sonar pings, no acoustic signs. The attack had come from nowhere. Inside Moscow, the Situation Room at the Ministry of Defense received fragmented updates. Lines of communication between Novorossiysk, Sevastopol, and Rostov were jammed with conflicting data. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu was briefed personally before noon, and within an hour, the Kremlin had ordered a full review of naval defense protocols in all Black Sea installations. Satellite imagery from Western intelligence confirmed what local reports already suggested. No damage to surrounding port structures, no large surface explosion, and no evidence of airstrikes. This was a precision underwater operation, a surgical strike that neutralized its target without collateral destruction. For Ukraine, this represented mastery over stealth. For Russia, it represented exposure on a scale never before seen in modern maritime warfare. The attack was not meant to sink, it was meant to send a message, and that message had been received in every command post from Moscow to Brussels. Throughout the day, Russian state media maintained silence. The official narrative described technical difficulties aboard one of the submarines, a phrase that fooled no one. By the afternoon, satellite photographs began circulating on open-source platforms, showing the damaged submarine half submerged, listing slightly to port. Naval analysts from London to Washington dissected the images frame by frame. The conclusion was unavoidable. The strike had been carried out with high-precision autonomous drones capable of navigating complex underwater environments and coordinating attacks without real-time human control. This was not an isolated incident, it was an evolution. In Kyiv, while officials avoided direct acknowledgement, quiet celebrations spread through defense circles. The operation had proven that Ukraine's technological innovation could outperform the conventional superiority of the Russian fleet. It wasn't just a victory of tactics, it was a victory of intellect, of adaptation under constraint. Years of improvisation under fire had birthed a new form of warfare, cheap, efficient, intelligent. And it had just rewritten the strategic equation of the Black Sea. By evening, international reactions began to surface. NATO issued a cautious statement noting developing security events in the Black Sea region. Western analysts openly discussed the implications. If Ukraine could disable a Russian submarine in one of its most fortified ports, what did that mean for the security of other naval installations? Could similar tactics be used elsewhere, against fleets, offshore infrastructure, or even ports on the Baltic or Arctic frontiers? The world watched, And in Moscow, unease grew into something more tangible. A recognition that the sea, once a sanctuary of Russian strength, had become a zone of uncertainty. Inside the Russian command, the pressure was immense. The Admiralty in St. Petersburg demanded explanations from the Black Sea Command. Why had the port's acoustic grid failed? Why did sonar not pick up the approaching drones? How could such a breach occur in what was considered one of the most technologically monitored coastal zones in the world? The answers, as investigators soon learned, were buried in complacency. The systems were built to detect large, fast-moving threats: torpedoes, submarines, ships. They were not designed for objects the size of a small scooter, moving silently inches above the seafloor, programmed to evade precisely the frequencies those systems relied upon. Throughout the next night, anti-submarine teams remained on high alert. Portable sonar systems scanned every inch of the inner harbor. Divers moved cautiously through the murky waters, searching for remnants of the drones. What they found confirmed their fears. Small fragments of composite material, specialized adhesives, and traces of advanced Western circuitry. The analysis pointed toward components smuggled from international markets, assembled in secret Ukrainian facilities. This hybrid engineering approach, using civilian technology for military innovation, was what made the Sea Babies so effective. They were simple enough to build quickly, but advanced enough to bypass traditional defenses. Across the Russian information space, attempts were made to control the narrative. State television avoided mentioning the port entirely, while online military channels circulated blurry footage and unverified reports. But the silence only fueled speculation. Naval forums and telegram groups connected to the Russian military began discussing the attack in detail. Leaked screenshots from internal communications revealed frustration among officers and disbelief among engineers. The illusion of safety had been broken, and no censorship could repair it. In Western capitals, defense ministries were already analyzing the broader implications. The concept of asymmetric naval warfare had been debated for years, but Ukraine had just demonstrated its practicality. The United States and the United Kingdom began reviewing coastal defense models, while smaller nations saw in the Sea Babies a vision of affordable deterrence. Military strategists began referring to the incident as the Novorossiysk model, a case study in how low-cost autonomous systems could outmaneuver expensive traditional fleets. As night fell again over Novorossiysk, the port was no longer operational. The crippled submarine remained moored in place, surrounded by cranes and salvage vessels. Its decks were quiet, its systems offline. The once proud symbol of Russian sea power now stood as evidence of vulnerability. The crew had been transferred, the dock sealed, and the area declared a restricted zone. But within military circles, the damage had already transcended the physical. It was a symbolic blow, a loss of confidence, a revelation that the balance of naval warfare had shifted irreversibly. Over the following days, reports emerged that Russia began relocating critical vessels further east, closer to Tuapse, and beyond the direct operational reach of Ukraine's drone network. This redeployment, while strategic, underscored the fear that had taken hold. For the first time in modern Russian history, the Black Sea Fleet was forced to act defensively not against a rival navy, but against machines smaller than a torpedo. The implications for global security were staggering. Traditional naval hierarchies, carriers, destroyers, submarines, had all been designed for a different era. Now, the battlefield belonged to the silent, the invisible, and the autonomous. By the end of December, new reports suggested that Ukraine was preparing to expand its unmanned operations. Satellite images showed activity near Odessa and Mykolaiv, where naval engineers and software specialists worked side by side to improve next-generation drone systems. International observers speculated that these developments could reshape not only the Black Sea theater, but maritime defense worldwide. The precedent had been set. Cost-effective technology could paralyze superior forces. And for every nation watching, the lesson was clear: adapt or fall behind. In the months that followed, the term Novorossiysk effect began to circulate among defense analysts and military think tanks. It described a phenomenon in which traditional deterrence failed against innovation born out of necessity. Ukraine, under constant pressure and limited by sanctions, had found a way to strike not through numbers, but through ingenuity. The incident marked a new phase of warfare: autonomous, intelligent, psychological. It wasn't about overwhelming the enemy, it was about making the enemy doubt the safety of its own territory. As the year turned toward its end, the image of the half-sunken Warszawianka became an emblem of the new era. It appeared on news reports, defense briefings, and intelligence presentations around the world. The quiet port where it lay was no longer just a military site. It had become a symbol, a reminder that the shape of power was changing. In this new age, the future of warfare would not be determined by who had the largest ships, but by who could build the smallest and smartest machines. Subscribe for more updates, because what happened that night in Novorossiysk was not an ending. It was the beginning of a revolution beneath the surface of the sea. A revolution that would redefine how nations think, fight, and survive in the oceans of tomorrow.